Okay, so we've all heard about Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? This idea that markets, just by themselves, magically create the best outcomes for everyone. But what if that's not always true? What happens when the market has a major blind spot? That's what we're digging into today: externalities. These are those really important, kind of fascinating moments where the market, if you just leave it alone, totally gets it wrong.
All right, so here's the plan for this explainer. Think of it as your study guide for the exam. We're going to start with the problem itself, this blind spot. Then, and this is super important, we'll actually graph the market failure. After that, we'll look at how the government can step in with public policy solutions. We'll even compare two big ones, taxes versus tradable permits. And to wrap it up, we'll check out private solutions and see if people can sometimes fix these problems themselves, without any government help at all.
So yeah, that invisible hand is such a powerful idea. You've got buyers and sellers all just looking out for themselves, and somehow that's supposed to create the best results for society as a whole. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. That whole theory rests on one huge assumption. It assumes that the only people affected by a deal are the buyer and the seller. So what happens when that's just not the case?
Yeah, this image really nails it. Think about it. In almost any market, you've got your two main players, the buyer and the seller, right? A paper mill sells paper to a company that makes books. Simple transaction. But what about the stuff that isn't part of that deal? What about the pollution that the factory pumps into the air? That affects everyone living nearby. Those people, they're bystanders. They had no say in the transaction, but they're stuck with a cost. That side effect, that uncompensated cost, is exactly what an externality is.
Okay, so here's the textbook definition you'll want to remember. An externality is the uncompensated impact of one person's actions on the well-being of a bystander. And that word, uncompensated, is everything. If the impact is bad, like factory pollution, we call that a negative externality. But they can be good too. Imagine your neighbor spends a ton of money restoring their beautiful old house. Well, that makes the whole street look better and probably bumps up your property value. That's a positive externality. You get a benefit you didn't pay for. All right, so now for the really crucial part. We know what an externality is, but why does it cause the market to fail? And for your exams, I guarantee you being able to draw this out and explain it on a graph is non-negotiable. So let's break this down piece by piece. Okay, before we get to the problem, let's just quickly refresh on our before picture. A perfectly efficient market. In a normal market, let's say for aluminum, the demand curve just shows how much buyers value it. We call that the private value. And the supply curve shows how much it costs the factories to make it, the private cost. Where they cross, that's our equilibrium, Q market. And at that exact point, total well-being, or welfare, is maximized. It's perfect. That's our efficient baseline. But now we throw a wrench in the works. Those aluminum factories, they're not just making aluminum. They're also pumping out smoke that's creating health problems for everyone downwind. That is a very real cost, but it's one the factory isn't paying. It's not on their balance sheet. So how in the world do we show that on our nice, clean graph?
This leads us to maybe the single most important idea for this whole topic: social cost. Just look at the formula here. The true cost to society isn't just the factory's cost. It's the factory's private cost plus that external cost of the pollution. It's both things added together. And because you're adding that extra cost on top, the social cost curve has to be above the regular supply curve. It shows what it really costs society to produce every single unit. And boom, right here, this is the market failure in graphical form. Look, the market on its own finds its equilibrium at Q market, right where private supply and demand meet. It only cares about private costs. But the truly efficient spot for society, Q optimum, is where demand meets that higher social cost curve. And what do you see? The market quantity is way bigger than the optimal quantity. The market is overproducing aluminum. And that's not just a little mistake. For every single one of those extra units between Q optimum and Q market, the real cost to society was more than the value people got from it. That gap, that's a deadweight loss. It's pure economic inefficiency.
Okay, so what about the flip side? What about a positive externality? Let's use education. When you get an education, you get a private benefit, like a better job. But we all benefit too, right? Society gets smarter voters, less crime, more innovation. That's an external benefit. So in this case, the social value is actually higher than the private value. The social value curve is above the demand curve. And what happens? The market produces at Q market, which is less than the optimal quantity for society, Q optimum. The market underproduces. It doesn't make enough. So the solution here isn't a tax. It's the opposite.
It's a subsidy to encourage more people to get educated and push us closer to that optimal point. Okay, so we've clearly established that the market, left to itself, messes this up. It either produces too much of a bad thing or not enough of a good thing. So this is the part where government often steps in. The question is, what can they actually do? Well, their options usually fall into two main buckets. First, you've got what's called command and control. This is pretty straightforward. It's the government just making rules. Things like you are forbidden from dumping toxic waste, or you can only pollute this much. Simple and direct. The second bucket, though, is what we call market-based policies. Instead of just ordering people around, the government uses incentives, like taxes and permits, to get businesses to want to do the right thing. And, just so you know, economists love talking about this second category. And the classic market-based tool is something called a corrective tax, or you'll hear it called a Pigovian tax after the economist Arthur Pigou. The whole idea is so simple, but it's brilliant. Just make the polluter pay for the damage they cause. Ideally, you set the tax exactly equal to the external cost of the pollution. What does this do? It forces the company to internalize the externality. It takes that external social cost and turns it into a private business cost on their spreadsheet. And look what happens on the graph. The tax bumps the private cost curve up until it's sitting right on top of the social cost curve. Just like that, the market now produces EQ optimum. Problem solved. So this leads to a really classic debate, and definitely something that could be an exam question. Which of these market-based policies is actually better? A tax or this other thing called tradable pollution permits? Let's break down the pros and cons. To really get this, let's use a concrete example. Let's say we have two factories, a paper mill and a steel mill. Each one is currently polluting 500 tons of gunk. The EPA steps in and says, nope, not happening. The total between you two can only be 600 tons. So how do they make that happen?
Well, option one is that old command and control approach. The EPA could just say, okay, you both have to cut down to 300 tons each. Done. It's simple, but think about it. What if it's super cheap for the paper mill to clean up its act, but it would cost the steel mill an absolute fortune? That regulation forces the steel mill to spend a ton of money. Now compare that to a corrective tax. The government puts a price, say $50,000, on every ton of pollution. Now each factory has a choice. The paper mill, where it's cheap to reduce pollution, is going to say, heck no, I'm not paying that tax. I'll just clean up instead. The steel mill, where it's super expensive, might say, you know what? It's actually cheaper for me to just pay the tax on some of my pollution. And look at the result. You get the exact same total reduction in pollution, but it's achieved at a way lower cost to society. Now that is economic efficiency.
Of course, there's the real world. And as this cartoon points out, nobody ever gets excited about a new tax. You can have economists with mountains of data showing that a gas tax would cut down on traffic jams, accidents, and pollution, but good luck to the politician who actually tries to propose it. It's just a tough sell politically. So if taxes are politically tricky, what's the other option? It's a system of tradable pollution permits, or what you probably know as cap and trade. It works like this. First, the government sets the cap, the total amount of pollution allowed, say 600 tons. Then it issues permits for that amount. Now, here's the trade part. Firms can buy and sell these permits from each other. So the paper mill, who can clean up on the cheap, will reduce its pollution way down and sell its extra permits to the steel mill. The steel mill finds it cheaper to buy those permits than to do all the cleanup itself. The permits naturally flow to the companies where it's most expensive to cut pollution. So check out this final point. It's really the key takeaway. A tax sets the price of pollution. Permits set the quantity. But in the end, they can both lead to the exact same efficient result by putting a price on pollution.
All right, so we've spent a lot of time on government solutions, but is that the only way? Did the government always have to be the one to fix it? Well, an economist named Ronald Coase came along and basically said, hold on a second, maybe not. He argued that sometimes people can sort these problems out on their own.
Okay, let's use the most famous example to explain this. You've got Dick, who owns a dog named Spot. The dog barks a lot. Dick gets a benefit from having Spot that he values at $500. But his neighbor Jane can't stand the barking. For her, it's a cost that she values at $800. Classic negative externality. So let's pause and think about this. Just from a pure efficiency standpoint, what should happen? Well, Jane's cost of $800 is way bigger than Dick's benefit of $500. So the efficient, socially optimal outcome is for the dog to go. But the big question is, can they figure this out on their own without getting courts or the government involved? And the Coase theorem says absolutely they can, as long as they can talk to each other and make a deal. Here's how it would work. Jane knows the dog costs her $800 in misery. Dick only values the dog at $500. So Jane can go over to Dick and say, look, I'll pay you $600 if you get rid of the dog. What happens? Dick takes the deal. He's better off. He gets $600 for something he only valued at $500, and Jane is better off. She pays $600 to avoid an $800 headache. They're both happier, and the efficient outcome is achieved. And what's really wild is that Coase showed it doesn't even matter who has the legal right to begin with. The efficient result happens either way.
But, and you knew there had to be a but, right? This is a huge one. This whole private bargaining thing only works if making the deal is free and easy. In the real world, we have something called transaction costs. The cost of hiring lawyers, the time it takes to negotiate, the hassle of enforcing the deal. If those costs are bigger than the $200 or $300 surplus they could get from making the deal, then the deal just isn't going to happen, and the private solution completely falls apart. And that's really what brings us to our final thought. Let's scale this up. Forget about a barking dog. Think about a massive global externality like climate change. We're not talking about two neighbors. We're talking about billions of people. Can you imagine the transaction cost of trying to get every single person on Earth to sit down and bargain out a private solution? It's impossible. It's absurd. And when private solutions fail so spectacularly, it forces us right back to thinking about those public market-based policies we talked about, things like a carbon tax or a global cap-and-trade system. It makes you wonder if, for the biggest problems we face, they're not just an option, but maybe the only viable path forward.